Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Jennifer Winward, founder and CEO of Winward Academy. Very excited to welcome you all to go through this incredibly important, constantly changing topic of ACT, SAT, and how those exams have been impacted by COVID, and also how we've seen changes to college admissions now that we're in more of a test optional environment. So again, welcome to you all. Here's a quick overview of our agenda for what's planned for us to discuss today. And one thing that I would love to share is that I'm going to be coming at you with a lot of information. But that being said, you will have tons of questions. So I absolutely encourage you to ask questions in the chat. I can pause during the presentation to review those questions. I just want to make sure that we can really get anything that's a burning, pressing issue for you addressed, while I also kind of hope to go through this framework of the agenda. So again, the hope is to kind of do an overview first. What's the impact on the pandemic in terms of the evolution of college admission? So what are the changes that we've seen in the past couple of years? What are these emerging trends? So what are the expectations that we now have for students who are currently graduating and in later classes? And then depending on how much time and how much interest you have, we can also go through some really, really deep dive specifics of the differences between the ACT and SAT. So we have these pie charts for each exam that break down exactly what's tested and how frequently, and how you can use that information to be strategic and to best support your preparation. And then of course, to provide some general tips for success. So as I started with today, we do have a lot to cover. So I'm just gonna jump in. But again, any questions that you have throughout the presentation, please feel free to write me in the chat. So first, we'll do a quick recap of kind of what we saw kind of pre and post COVID. So class of 2020, right? So those are students who would have been taking their exams in 2019. So prior to the pandemic, we had 4 million students taking the SAT and the ACT. And then of course, March of 2020 is when COVID hit. So what we saw, of course, was in that spring that directly followed the introduction of COVID in our world, tests were just canceled, right? ACT canceled all exams, College Board canceled all exams. But then kind of once the fall term started, right, they were still trying to have exams in spaces that could be safe and where people would feel comfortable testing, but the tests weren't even offered, right, in that spring. So how did the schools respond, right? Well, selective universities can't say this test is required for you to apply if students can't even take it, right? That's completely unfair. So what 95% of colleges did is they became test optional. They basically said, look, if you end up having access to this exam and you have a score that you want to submit, great, we will consider it. But if you don't have a score, then you're not excluded from being able to apply. So if you think about how things were a couple of years ago, right? If you didn't have an ACT or an SAT score, you were not eligible. Like I could apply to UCLA, but if I didn't have an ACT or SAT score, I was immediately rejected. It was considered a requirement of the application. So this is a huge change, right? Because this is a big test, right? It's something that people have been taking for almost 100 years. You know, it's been a big part of this process for a long time. So then what happened is in the fall, right, continuing the story of why colleges needed to be test optional, is that more than half of students who registered, like they were trying to take the exams, ended up with their exams canceled or rescheduled. So again, you have this trend where all the tests are canceled, no one can take it. Okay, now it's the fall, we're going to try to offer it, and still half of students weren't able to take the exam. So what we saw for the class of 2021 is that we saw a 22% decrease in the number of ACT test takers and a 32% decrease in the number of SAT test takers. So while those are big decreases, right, we're still talking about millions of students who took these exams. Now, for a lot of students, that happens because their state graduation requirements for high school are the ACT or the SAT. So they have to take these exams as a graduation requirement that's mandated by the state. So again, this isn't even something for college admissions. This is purely a way that the state is measuring outcomes for students. Now, the impact on college admissions specifically is that in this new test optional environment, we've seen a big increase in the number of college applications being submitted, but colleges are accepting the same number of people. So they might have more applications, but if the number of spots is staying the same, well, then admission rates are going down. So the question, of course, becomes, which is likely why all of you are here with us tonight, what is next, right? What does this mean for me, for my family, for my teen, etc.? So just to kind of show you again, this kind of pre to post evolving testing policy, you can see kind of the main change that we have here is that we've gone from an environment in which, 65% almost of colleges required, 34% of colleges had it optional, to now all of a sudden for class of 2022, so for students who are graduating this year, right, for the most part, they had access to ACT and SAT last year. So again, this was when the tests were not canceled in 2021, but we still have this test optional environment. And so the burning question that I get from parents every single day, especially parents of juniors, current juniors, is that so many colleges have not yet released what their policies are going to be. So even juniors right now who are getting into spring of junior year, these real exams are happening right now, or they would be happening at the beginning of senior year. Even those students don't know right now if the ACT and SAT are going to be required for when they apply this coming fall. So it's a very stressful time for a lot of families because they feel like they need to prepare, assuming that they might need them, because again, we're still waiting for a lot of the big colleges, especially the most competitive schools, to actually say what their decisions are going to be for students who are graduating in the class of 2023. So what a lot of families are doing is they're figuring, okay, well, if there's a chance that it's going to be required, we should be planning for it now so that we don't end up behind. If I take it and I do great, okay, that's amazing. I'll just submit a score, even in a test optional environment. Now, some of you may have heard the big news from this week about the CSUs, so the California State Universities that are no longer going to use the ACT or SAT for admissions decisions. So the UC schools, University of California system in California, right? So like UC Berkeley, UCLA, UC San Diego, along with the CSUs, so Cal Poly Pomona, San Diego State, Long Beach, etc., are not using ACT and SAT for admissions decisions. They are using the exams to do course placement for students to help them pass out of remedial courses. So, being able to start at a higher level at the university. But again, they're not using them for admissions decisions. Now, a couple things that I also wanted to go over, right, is you can imagine that ACT and SAT are feeling squeezed, right? They had fewer test takers, those 22 to 32% drops in the number of people taking the exams, right? That's a big chunk. So what's interesting is how ACT and SAT have responded and kind of what some of their plans are in response to these changes. So the first thing I want you to know is that ACT actually, by the way, had these changes planned for September of 2020, but COVID really disrupted the rollout of this new approach. And it's been really sad for me, honestly, because I think that these decisions that ACT had made to allow these section retakes, which I'll explain here in a second for you, would have been amazing for students. And they just keep postponing because it's going to be this huge revamp for them to roll out this new policy. And they just haven't had the bandwidth to be able to do it. So let me explain what that change is. And I'm crossing my fingers that ACT rolls this out this coming September. So again, it would have a 2-year delay, but at least it would be here. So right now, if I want to take the ACT in April, I sit down, I take the entire exam. I am required to take every single section. So there are 4 main sections, which we'll talk about in a second: English, math, reading, and science. So every time I take the ACT, I have to take all 4 sections. So let's say I take it in April and I do really well in 3 of the 4, but I really just want to redo math. Well, I don't have that option. If I want my math score to go up, then in June, when the ACT is offered the next time, I would have to redo all 4 sections just to try to improve my math. Now, what's amazing that ACT, again, was planning to do in September 2020, but keeps postponing, is that they're going to allow students to retake just by section. So going back to my original example, if I took the ACT in April, loved 3 of my scores, but really only was concerned about my math, I could take the exam in June, but only take the math. So I could show up, do my 1 hour for math, and then ACT would calculate a new composite score for me with the 3 scores from April and the 1 score from June. So again, this is incredible for students, especially because when you're taking these exams, you're there for 4 hours, right? The test itself is 3 hours, but you have a little 10-minute break. You have the, time in the beginning with all the instructions. I mean, you're there and you're tired and you're anxious and you kind of have all that adrenaline going for that 4-hour period. So what's important to consider is, for a lot of students, the sections toward the end, they're tired, right? To be there for 4 hours and have one 10-minute break is not a lot. So I've always felt that student scores sometimes looked lower than really their potential, right? And they looked lower because students were tired and having trouble focusing, not because they weren't capable of doing better. So this new retake approach was incredible. And again, ACT was planning to do this and they just keep postponing, but I'm hoping that we see this hopefully in the next year, that these policies will finally happen. The other thing too, the ACT has been floating an idea for the past 2 years of an at-home online version, but there's still a giant question mark whether that's going to happen. Now, even bigger changes are coming for the SAT. So the SAT has been changing itself a lot over the past decade, kind of continuing to redo the test. And so now they're planning another big change, which is they're going fully digital. So no more paper and pencil exams. These changes will start, by the way, in 2024. So they're planning to test this new approach internationally in 2023, and then to bring it here in 2024. So what that means is the test is now going to be shorter. So instead of the current 3 hours, it's going to be 2 hours in length. Have 2 sections, one that combines reading and writing and one that has math. A big difference is that the current SAT has 2 math sections, one with a calculator and one without a calculator. This new SAT will be all calculator. So that's one way that it kind of is more similar to the ACT, because currently a lot of students are drawn to the ACT because the ACT allows a calculator on all math questions, whereas the SAT doesn't. The SAT has an entire section of math questions on which students can't use calculators. And as much as we would love to think that all students are super comfortable doing math without a calculator, the reality, of course, is that they aren't. So for a lot of students, the non-calculator math section on the SAT can be intimidating and can really push students toward the ACT. Now, for those of you who are joining us who may have taken a GRE exam or something like that that was on a computer in this adaptive testing format, taking an exam that's adaptive is a stressful experience. I took the GRE before going to grad school, and I remember even I felt like, oh my gosh, this is so crazy. Like as I get more questions right, the questions are going to keep getting harder and harder and harder. And that is, again, something that's intimidating for a lot of students. So I think a lot of young people are going to really feel like they're going to want to have practice with this new format, because again, the idea that the new exam is adaptive is something that the SAT is doing to try to preserve exam integrity, to try to reduce cheating, and because they, believe that with their algorithm, they can really accurately project a score, which again, if a student gets a question right, I'm going to give you a harder question. If you miss something, I'm going to give you an easier question, right? And that the test is going to adapt as I progress, which means no 2 students could end up with the same exam unless, of course, they have the exact same pattern of right and wrong answers. Now, the biggest way that the SAT is shortening itself is by making the reading section shorter. So currently the reading section is 65 minutes, it's long, but they're going to make the reading passages shorter. So that's kind of a big place where they're actually going to chunk the exam or to shorten it. Okay, so a little bit to now transition to share more about what we've seen in terms of how this test optional environment has affected college applications. So as I mentioned at the beginning, right, and I hate sharing these data because I feel like I'm the bearer of bad news and I'm making families more anxious and more stressed, which I've been doing this for over 20 years. I already know how stressful this is, and I already know how anxious parents and students are. So again, I'm sharing this information because I want you to have it, but I fully recognize that learning about these trends is not something that's going to help you assuage your anxiety. It's definitely something that's going to make you feel a little bit more stressed about kind of how things have changed with college admissions post-COVID. So what you're looking at here are the early action, kind of early decision application. So again, when a student applies early to a college, it's basically a way of communicating, hey, you are a top choice school if it's early decision, because then of course it's binding. If I get in, I have to go, I'm expected to go. Early action is more flexible. You're applying early because you want to kind of hear back earlier from the university, but it's not a binding decision. So what you're seeing is that some of these top schools in the country that we have seen increases. So what we're seeing here, I'll just kind of break it down. We've gone from the class of 2020 to the class of 2021. And overall, kind of the color at the top is how many people applied. And then this darker color is how many people were accepted. So even if we jump here to Harvard, you'll notice that the number of students accepted went down. However, the number of applications increased by 57%. So a 57% increase in the number of people who applied early to Harvard, and the number of people they accepted actually went down. You'll notice here at Dartmouth, maybe they accepted a little bit more, right? But for the most part, the number of people being accepted is kind of staying steady, decreasing a tiny bit or increasing a tiny bit. But the overall biggest impact that we see here are these drastic increases, 21%, 29%, 57% more students applying. And the number one reason students cite for why would Harvard all of a sudden have this huge increase in applications? Well, it's because the ACT and SAT are now optional. So students who previously would never have applied because they wouldn't likely have hit the average numbers that Harvard accepts are now going for it, right? They're like, well, I might as well try, right? You have nothing to lose except maybe a couple hours of writing extra essays and stuff like that. But for the most part, once you've put together your Common App, your main essays, if you end up wanting to apply to Harvard, you're basically paying the application fee and putting together a few supplements. But again, what we're seeing here is that, and this, by the way, happened again this current year. So I'll show you some data from that as well. But we are seeing these huge increases in the number of students applying, and then the number of students getting in is not also increasing, right? These colleges have a set capacity in terms of dorms and instructors and classrooms. So they're not accepting more people just because more people are applying. So what, of course, that means is that we see a decrease in the acceptance rate. Now I'm showing you this stem and leaf plot because there's something really important here that is stressing out students that I want to actually explain to you. So people keep talking, how in the world is the average SAT score for students accepted at a school like Harvard increasing? Like, how could it have ever increased, right? It was already so high. So I'm going to show you how that's possible. So what I'm showing you here is kind of pre-COVID, how many students were accepted to Harvard with scores in certain ranges. So 25% of students, these are SAT scores, by the way, 25% of students accepted to Harvard had between a 1570 and a 1600, like a near perfect SAT score, 25% of their class. 50%, so that middle 50% of their students were between a 1460 and a 1570. Then 25% of students accepted to Harvard had a score below a 1460, right? So when we look at this, we kind of think, okay, well, these numbers are still, for the most part, very high. So how in the world could this kind of middle 50% of people accepted ever go up? Well, the answer is that students who previously would have been required to put their SAT score, maybe I scored a 1250 or something like that. I still absolutely could have been accepted to Harvard with a 1250 SAT score, right? 25% of students they accepted are in that range. However, those students are choosing not to put that score. So if you remove this chunk of students who used to be required to put their score, who now no longer are required, right? They're choosing not to list it. So now the only students who are reporting scores are at this super high level. It's going to make it seem like the average is increasing, right? Because the pool of the number of people submitting their scores has gone down, and just naturally the people self-reporting scores have higher scores. So when you hear this information, like, oh my gosh, the average SAT scores for the accepted classes are increasing, there's a data reason for that, right? There's a statistical reason for that. It's not because they're actually accepting people with much higher scores. It's because people who previously scored on the lower side, like, and it's so weird to say lower, like getting under a 1460, like this is not a low score, right? But again, like in that, the 25% underneath of 1460, if you're not going to write it down, they can't use it in their average calculation. So what I am suggesting to families is, if you decide to take the ACT or SAT because you want to have one additional data point, you feel like you could do a great job, you want to try to set yourself apart from your peers, you know things are competitive, and you know want to go for it and study and put in the time and take the exam, people always ask, well, what do I have to hit to know if I should report it or not? So what we're encouraging families to do is to look at what these numbers were prior to COVID, right? What were these kind of ranges where schools were accepting students? And then, excuse me, if your score is in that range of where they used to accept students, then you should absolutely report it, right? But there's this notion for people today, like, oh, well, I didn't get a perfect score, so I'm not going to put it. That's nuts, right? If you have a really strong score, you should absolutely report it, because again, it can only help you, right? It can't hurt you. One more thing that I wanted to show in terms of changing trends, one sec, I just have a sip of water, is what we've seen in terms of the demographic makeup of accepted students. So we're seeing big increases in the number of first-generation college students being accepted, the number of students who would be eligible for federal financial aid, right? So definitely trying to support students who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, who would previously maybe not have been accepted in as high of numbers, who are now, these colleges are really pushing to accept more students and to really diversify their student bodies. We especially see that with this increase in the number of African-American and Black students who are being accepted. And then this is specific to Harvard, by the way, for their early action. We did see decreases in the number of Asian-American, Latinx, and white students. And then we pretty much saw consistent acceptance for Native American and Native Hawaiian students. So these are kind of the trends that we saw again in terms of changing demographics between 2020 and 2021. Not surprising, right? UCLA, which is the most applied to college, set a record between 2020 and 2021 with this 28% increase in the number of students applying. By the way, UCLA decisions, which were just released in for this last batch for students in the class of 2022, they saw 10,000 more people apply. So they actually had 149,000 applications in this most recent cycle. So again, what we're seeing, big jumps in terms of the number of people applying, and in terms of the students who are applying, we see big increases in African-American students, in Latinx students. Transfer students, we saw an increase from 2020 to 2021, but in this most recent cycle, they did not see that same increase in the number of transfer students applying, which also is probably not surprising given that community college enrollment really decreased a lot during COVID. So there are fewer people applying to transfer from a community college to a four-year university because there are just fewer students attending community colleges. So that is one difference that we did see in this most recent cycle compared to the change we saw from 2020 to 2021. Now, you're probably all asking yourselves, right, what does this mean for me? Do I need to take this test or not? So what I recommend you do is you find your list of 9 schools, 10, 11, 12 schools, right, whatever it is, the schools you're currently thinking about where you know you want to apply, go to their websites, to their admissions tabs or pages, find what is their current policy on ACT and SAT. Right? It will be very clear on their website because the colleges are under a lot of pressure to be transparent about this. We actually hosted a Q&A with Dartmouth Admissions, and someone on the call specifically asked, you know, if someone has a score versus doesn't have a score, are you going to release data that show your percentage acceptance rate for students with scores versus a percentage acceptance rate for students without scores? The school took the position of not releasing that information because they're trying not to create additional stress for students in this process that has already become more stressful. So you're not necessarily going to find that information. And again, that's probably the answer or the question that every single parent wants to know, right? If I take the test and do really well, am I going to have a better chance of getting in? And what are those numbers, right? Everybody wants to see those numbers. Colleges are not releasing those numbers, right? Because I think they're just concerned, to Dartmouth's point, what they shared about releasing that type of information and having that create even more stress for students where things have just already been really tough for the past couple years. So when you look for colleges, right, I put USC and Stanford on here because they're two of the most popular colleges where students apply. What are their policies, right? And what you can see is that for the most part, what they're communicating is in this test optional environment. If you feel like your exam score positively reflects your ability to be ready academically and to do well, please report your scores. But then they also have this caveat of if you don't put your scores, you're not going to be at a disadvantage. So the whole idea here is that it's something that can help you, but if you don't have a score, they can't reject you because you don't have a score. So that's kind of the current environment, which again, is very gray, right? This is not a black and white thing. It feels very fuzzy because it is, which is also why parents are so stressed about this and teens are so stressed. So for the most part, the advice that college counselors are giving, that we're giving, is we're telling students, look, if you feel like you can do really well, you can, if you're maybe starting in a place that's strong, but you want to build it up and you can really crush the exam, it is something that can help you. But if you put in that time and then at the end of the day, when you apply, you just feel like your score is not going to give you that boost, it's maybe not a true reflection of your abilities, then it's something that you're kind of lucky that if it's test optional, you're not required to put it. That being said, we're going to have to keep a very close eye because if any of you joining us are parents of sophomores or freshmen or even younger students, again, we don't really know what to expect in terms of whether these exams are going to be required or not at so many of the universities. So they're kind of still making those decisions and we just have to keep an eye on it. So that's why it's important for you that you actually go to the websites for the colleges, do this check-in yourself to make sure that you don't miss something, because if something ends up being required and you don't have it, or you weren't prepared for it and then you take the exam and you don't love your score, again, that's the situation we're trying to avoid. Now, people ask all the time, why do colleges want to be test optional? Like, what are the benefits to them to stay in a test optional environment? So what colleges say in terms of why they want to be test optional is that they're increasing the diversity of their accepted students, which a lot of colleges are placing a tremendous emphasis on in the current environment. They also love to see that their application numbers go up, right? When more people apply, it creates a lot more stress and a lot more work for the admissions officers, of course, but it makes colleges look good, right? UCLA looks good that it's the most applied to college in the world and they have 149,000 applications, right? That's a big number. It has a big wow factor. And as we all know, right, colleges like that. Also keep in mind that when students are applying, they have to pay an application fee. So colleges are also experiencing a boost in revenue by charging people to apply, and then having more people apply, naturally, they're able to bring in more revenue. They're also, as I mentioned before, showing increases in their average SAT and ACT scores. I went over that in detail because I do not want that data point to create more stress for you. Again, they like to say that their SAT and ACT scores are increasing because, again, it creates this whole feeling and perception of being competitive and the top and all of that. But remember, the reason their average scores are going up is because people are only submitting their scores if their scores are high. The other thing that's interesting too is that the US News and World Report ranking scale actually assigns a beta weight to colleges when they're ranked, when they're test optional. So sometimes colleges can see a little boost in their ranking when they're in a test optional environment. In general, the reason students are continuing to take these exams is, what is the value of having a high test score? That your application can be competitive, right? There's something else that you have that maybe someone else doesn't, where if there's a tough decision and you feel like you're equally compared to someone else, maybe there's something that you have, again, that other application wouldn't have. A lot of students have shared anecdotally that when they have these high scores, that they're receiving additional financial aid packages, additional scholarships, and also a lot of specific programs are still asking for ACT and SAT scores to meet their requirements for their programs. So that's also something that is beneficial for students when they have those scores. So next question, how do I improve, right? All right, maybe I'm going to go for it. I'm going to take this test, but how do I know what to do or where to start or how to grow my score? So what is important for you to all know, because a lot of people go into the ACT and SAT concerned that they have to know calculus, and they have to know AP physics or AP chemistry. And they're like, I don't have those really tough classes in my schedule. I'm not ready for the exam. What they don't realize, however, is that the ACT and SAT are designed to basically test students on what they've learned through sophomore year of high school. So these exams are really testing on core subjects, core foundations, like how strong of a reader are you? How are your grammar skills, right? How do you remember rules for commas and periods and semicolons and colons? And what math do you remember? So for a lot of students, the math is challenging, not necessarily because it's hard math, but because it's math that they learned in 7th grade and 8th grade that they just don't remember the formulas or they just don't remember the rules. Same thing with grammar. There's so many students who struggle in the grammar, and it's because they haven't learned the rules for subject-verb agreement and parallel structure and pronoun agreement and apostrophes. They just haven't gone over those nitty-gritty specifics for years and years. So the way that we like to think about preparation for this is that it's not this review of this really tough content. It's about understanding core foundations and fundamentals that are going to serve you for your life. So being a stronger reader, being a stronger writer, knowing grammar rules so that you can present yourself in writing, whether you're emailing a professor, applying for a job, putting together your resume, writing your essay for college, doing an essay for your English class, whatever it is, right? Having this core set of knowledge is so valuable. So putting in that time to revisit those foundations, that is the number one way that students improve. Just remembering how important it is to be focused, right? So being mindful of yourself and what are things you can do to take great care of yourself in terms of sleep and nutrition and preparation and breathing techniques or whatever it is, right? We need to make sure that you can stay focused for this long period of time. So practicing that is really important. Now, part of practicing that is that when you make mistakes, when you take a practice test, practice ACT or practice SAT, and you make mistakes, the worst thing to do is to just go, oh, okay, here's my score, I'm going to move on. No, your job when you take a practice test is to go back and redo every single question that you missed to make sure that you know how to do it correctly. So I tell my students all the time, okay, you took an ACT diagnostic. You're not allowed to take ACT test 1 until you are 100% confident with every single question you missed on the diagnostic. You have to understand what you missed, why you missed it, how to solve it correctly immediately. So when you see that question again, boom, you know how to do it. You have to get to that level before you continue to take more and more and more practice tests. So that's really important that students do that process of reviewing their mistakes and then reviewing them again until they feel really comfortable. The other thing too that I've seen a lot for students, and sometimes this is something that's honestly tough to address when you're already a junior in high school or a senior in high school, is just reading skills. So when COVID first happened, and oh my gosh, parents would call and email constantly, what do I do? What do I do? My student's not getting anything from school. School's canceled. They're not learning anything online. What should I be having my team do? The number one thing and advice that I gave to every single parent was the same. And it was read. Just make sure that your students read hours a day, if possible, because reading skills are so critical forever. If you are not a strong reader, when you go to take these exams, it is so much harder for you. The time pressure is harder. You read a paragraph or you read a section and then you go, oh my gosh, I just read that whole thing. I can't even remember what I read. I have to start over and I have to reread it. All of that, right, is taking time and is creating stress in the middle of an exam. On the other hand, when you have students who are strong readers, They can read a passage, they can look at a question and go, oh, that was answered right here. Let me reread that. Boom, got it. That's the answer next, right? When you can be really systematic, where you can remember what you read and where you read it. Again, you don't have to remember all the details, but if you know where it was answered or where it was talked about, you can go back and reference that and then be 100% confident in your answer. Reading skills are so important because, again, if you are struggling with your reading, the time management will be harder. You won't be able to finish. Then you'll get stressed that you're having to guess at the end, right? A lot of that, it just kind of compounds to be very stressful for students. So enhancing reading skills is critical. All right, let me do a quick pause and look at the chat. Okay, it doesn't look like any questions have come in yet, so I'll just kind of keep powering through here. But again, any questions that you have, please feel free to put them in the chat. Now, if you take away nothing from this presentation except what I'm just about to share with you, then this has been a great use of your time, because what I'm about to share is the most important tip that you could get or that your teen could receive going into these exams. So first thing to know, the SAT no longer penalizes for guessing. So if you get a question wrong, you don't lose points. I remember when I took the SAT, it was like, oh, don't guess unless you're down to 2, because if you get it wrong, you're going to lose 0.25 points, right? You lost a quarter of a point every time you made a mistake. So if you had no clue how to do something, or if you completely ran out of time, you left things blank. Well, the ACT has never had that. The ACT never took away points for wrong answers. So students always felt comfortable guessing on the ACT, because if they ran out of time or had no clue, hey, whatever, I'll just bubble something. You never know, maybe I'll get it right. And then of course that can help your score. It wasn't until 2016 that SAT changed that. So now the SAT, just like the ACT, no longer penalizes for guessing, in the sense that you don't lose points when you make a mistake. So what I find so fun, and when I'm in person doing this presentation with families and can do a poll in the audience, that always makes this more fun. But I always ask students, hey, if you ran out of time on the ACT or SAT, what would you guess? 9 times out of 10, I mean, for sure, 90% of students say C. They would guess the letter C. Somewhere in middle school or something, there's something that gets said in families like, oh, if you ever run out of time, guess C, right? That's just kind of becomes part of something that a lot of students learn. So I was really curious about this. And I went through 80 ACT and SAT exams, real tests, and I looked at the last 10 questions of every single section to basically count how frequent is the right answer A, B, C, or D at the end of an exam, right? When most people run out of time, what's the most frequent right answer? Not surprisingly, C is the right answer. By the way, it says C/H because on the ACT, the first bubble will go AF, AF. The second bubble goes BG, BG. They just changed the letter to make it easier for students if they skip a question that they don't mess up their bubble sheet. But technically C and H are the same thing. It's the third bubble, right? A and F are the same. It's the first bubble. So not surprisingly, at the end of an exam, when most students run out of time and most students guess, C is the least frequent right answer. What's next is B. Then the first bubble and the last bubble are pretty much, I mean, D obviously from this sample was a little bit higher. But whenever I have students ask me, hey, if I run out of time, Dr. Winward, what should I do? I always tell them, guess all the first bubble or all the last bubble. Because again, that's where statistically you'll have a better chance of getting them right if you always guess the same letter. Students love to make zigzag patterns with their guesses. That's actually not the best approach. Statistically, you have a better chance if you always guess the same letter. So again, just some good kind of info to share with you. Okay, let me just double check the chat again, see if any other questions have come in. All right, I'm going to go ahead and just keep going then. So let me dig into a little bit of specifics of kind of what to expect for ACT and SAT test day. So for the ACT, there are 4 main sections: English, math, reading, and science. This writing section at the end is optional. But what you'll notice is that students don't get very many breaks, right? So you show up for the ACT, you got this English and math back to back, 1 10-minute break, then you do reading and science. If you have the writing section, that essay that's optional at the end, you do get a 5-minute break in between, but not all students take the writing section. If you're not sure if you need it or not, again, check the requirements for the colleges to which you're applying. If you don't know yet where you're applying and you're a strong writer, definitely do the essay, because again, it's one of those things that can only help you, right? Having a strong essay score is great. There is so much writing that happens in college. And from my experience teaching college and teaching undergrads, I've seen the quality of writing deteriorate over the past decade. And I know for me, seeing students who struggle sometimes with their writing is concerning, because sometimes they have ideas in their head of what they're thinking, but if they can't translate that down, again, then it can hurt them, because they're not going to garner points if they're not able to be clear about what they're trying to communicate. So if you are a strong writer and you enjoy essays, right, take the essay, because when you do really well, again, it's just one more thing that can help you in the application process. Now, one big difference when I just went from ACT to SAT that I hope you noticed is that after this break on the ACT, there are these two shorter sections. One is called reading, one is called science, and they're 35 minutes each. So if you think about it, okay, so at the end of the ACT, I have 70 total minutes, the 35 and 35, for a reading section and a science section. Now, all of a sudden on the SAT, there's this reading section, right? No separate section called science, but there's a reading section that's 65 minutes. So what's kind of sneaky that the SAT has done, which has caused a lot of confusion for families, which is why I'm going over this so explicitly, is that on the ACT, I'm going to go back here. On the ACT, the reading section has those 4 passages, all reading comprehension. The science section actually is not testing you on your knowledge of biophysics or chemistry. It's testing you on your ability to read information about science, to look at a figure, to look at a table, to look at a diagram, to read an x-axis, a y-axis, to look at a table and to look at a trend and to extrapolate beyond a trend, right? If these things are increasing, it would continue to increase, right? So looking for trends in data and interpreting figures and tables and diagrams. So this ACT science section is very sneaky. I tell students it's kind of like an open book test. Every answer is given to you. The challenge is that you have to find it with the time pressure. So what's sneaky that SAT did is it has this one long reading section that's 65 minutes. That's technically like a combination of the ACT reading and science together. The reason I say that is that the reading section on the SAT has 5 passages. 2 of them are about science and have figures and tables and diagrams. So again, the ACT separates it, those 2 shorter ones, so you get 70 minutes total of being tested on that skill. Whereas on the SAT, it's one longer section of 65 minutes, and they're kind of blending it together. So when you hear people say, oh, I'm not good at science, I think I shouldn't take the ACT, again, encourage that student to try it, because even though the student might not come into it knowing every physics rule and chemistry rule, that doesn't matter. All that matters is that the student can read and can interpret figures and tables and diagrams. So it's worth trying. The one thing that does happen for students too is that the science is at the end. I've heard a million times, gosh, if the science section was first, I would do so much better, right? Because again, when it's there at the end, you're tired, you're losing focus. Sometimes, your mind just isn't as sharp to like go back and forth between a question and a passage or a question and a figure or a table. But all the answers are there, right? You're kind of playing hide and go seek in that section because they are asking questions about content that they are providing to you. So anyway, that's kind of this whole thing with ACT and SAT, the reading science versus just the reading. You get your break, you come back and do the writing and language, which is the grammar section, plus the math without a calculator. You do those back to back. You get a shorter break, and then comes the math calculator section at the end. So as we chatted about, right, on the ACT, this math section, all 60 questions, you get a calculator for all of them. On the SAT, they're dividing up the math into these 2 sections. So 58 questions total, pretty much the same as the ACT having 60 questions, But the big difference is that 20 of those questions on the SAT, you do not get a calculator. In terms of how these are scored, I do want to kind of just show, or excuse me, not how they're scored. Yes, I'm going to talk about how they're scored, but also other differences between them. Let's just kind of do a high level general overview, ACT versus SAT. So what you'll notice is that if you're not doing the essay, they're practically the same amount of time. If you do the exam with writing on the ACT, clearly it gets longer. Whereas on the SAT, the essay is no longer offered. So this happened as a result of COVID. SAT dropped the subject test, so it no longer offers subject tests, and dropped the essay. This is likely because they had to pay humans, right? People had to grade those essays. And I think that just because they lost a lot of money during the pandemic, it just was something that was an easy place to help their balance sheet, right? Well, if we're not paying all these people to score essays, we can save money. So they no longer offer the essay on the SAT. You can only take the essay on the ACT. Okay, sorry, I had 5 text messages from my husband and we have a baby at home. And so I just wanted to check quickly and make sure that everything is okay with her. And she's good. It was just about dinner. So we can deal with that later. All right, apologies for that short break. Just wanted to make sure she was okay. In terms of the sections on the ACT and SAT, so the ACT, as we already talked about, right, has those 4 sections: the English, math, reading, and science. How is the final score determined? Well, your score in those 4 sections, everything's added together, and then they take an average. They divide by 4. That's going to give you your overall score based on those 4 sections. And then that writing score is a separate number. It doesn't get used to calculate the composite. The SAT, you end up with 2 scores. So you might be sitting there going, well, that's strange. The SAT had 4 sections, and you would be correct. So the SAT has 4 sections. The reading and the writing and language combine to give you 1 score in EBRW, which stands for evidence-based reading and writing. Then the 2 math sections on the SAT, the math no calculator and math calculator, those combine to give you 1 math score. So again, on the ACT, you're getting these separate scores for each section, whereas on the SAT, 2 sections combine to 1 score in evidence-based reading and writing, and 2 sections combine to give you 1 score in math. The actual way that the exams are scored can be very confusing for families, which is why we have ACT and SAT conversion tables all over our website and all over our e-learning site, because people are always trying to compare and understand how the exams match up to each other. In terms of when they're offered, so both exams are offered 7 times per year. Some months are the same, right, where they have overlap, and other times they're kind of rotating. So in general, just important to know that you do have 7 opportunities with each of these exams throughout the year. In terms of the scoring breakdown, so I did mention this already a little bit. The ACT composite score is calculated as an average. So your 4 sections get added together, divided by 4, that's your composite. ACT is very nice and uses rounding. They follow rounding rules. So if I added up my scores and divided by 4 and it was a 29.5, that would round to a 30. If it's a 29.25, it rounds down to a 29. But they do follow those rounding conventions. So a lot of students luck out where their average is a 29.5, but it gets rounded up. With the SAT, again, you have that 1 score in evidence-based reading and writing, the 1 score in math. Those get added together to then be your overall SAT score. So I think what I'll probably do, just because I want to make sure we have time for questions, let me see if any questions have come into the chat. No questions in the chat. Let me check the Q&A. No questions in the Q&A. Okay, what I'll probably do is just go through this slide and then just pause and see if any questions come in. But please do write to me if you have any questions or want me to go over anything that we haven't covered. What I'll plan to do is kind of end on this slide, which gives kind of just this big picture testing advice. Like, how do I improve my score on these exams? So the number 1 first thing to do is to take a diagnostic, to get your hands on a real past ACT or real past SAT and take the test in the conditions in which you would take the real one. It's really important so that you can see how you're starting. You can look at your mistakes. You can learn from your mistakes. You can also look for trends or patterns in terms of what are the types of questions that you're missing. So then you kind of know what to do in the future. So starting with a diagnostic is critical. Then what you can do is compare the scores to each other. Well, how did I do on the ACT versus the SAT? And did one test emerge as the stronger of the two? When you look at that comparison, you can determine which test to take and then, of course, when to take it. Next thing is the most important part of this preparation, reviewing your content area gaps. You have to figure out what are your mistakes, what are your patterns, what do you not know because you've never learned it, or what do you not know because you haven't seen it for a long time, and then put in that time to review those gaps, to review those content areas and make sure that you are relearning that content or, of course, learning it for the first time. After you put in that time to review those content area gaps, now it's time to do more timed practice. So you want to then put in that time. Okay, I took a diagnostic, I got my English score, I looked at my patterns, I really needed to review punctuation, agreement, and parallelism. I reviewed that content, I feel better about what I've learned. Okay, now I'm going to do another timed English section so that I can expose myself to more past exams. I can track how my patterns have changed. I can make sure that I'm growing in those areas that I reviewed. And I can also look at, okay, where did I not improve? Okay, now I need to go back and do that. So it's incredibly systematic. But the worst thing that people do is they jump from a diagnostic just to doing more practice. This process is all about quality over quantity. Taking practice test after practice test after practice test will not change your score unless you review every single mistake in between and actually grow and learn from your mistakes. You should only be taking more practice tests when you understand every mistake you made on the past one and when you've put in time to review those content area gaps. That's when you're ready to do another one. After you take those practice tests, you're just going to keep going with the cycle. You have to review your mistakes. You have to do detailed corrections for every single mistake. Otherwise, again, you're just going to keep taking exams, but if you're not learning in between each one, you're not going to see the growth that you're looking for. So you really have to be disciplined. I tell my students all the time, you're amazing. You just took a practice test for 4 hours. That's great. However, the more important, it could be 4 hours, it could be 1 hour, 2 hours, but just that more important time is what you're going to now spend reviewing that test that you took and learning from every single mistake. That is where the most important part of this review process comes from. And by the way, you're building great study habits, you're reviewing great content, and you're just building your skills in general, which of course is really important. Okay, I did have a question that just came in. Can I please comment on strategies for the PSAT and how that links to national merit? And does our course prepare students for the PSAT? Yes, that's a great question. So the PSAT is a shorter version of the SAT, and it's administered by schools directly, usually in October. The vast majority of students will take it in October and they'll get their scores in December. There are makeups of the PSAT offered in January, but you'll be doing that kind of through your high school. So they have a PSAT 9 that students take in 9th grade. They have a PSAT 10 that students take in 10th grade, but then the main PSAT, the one that connects to national merit qualifications and scholarships, is the one administered in 11th grade. So why that's important is if you score in the top 1% for your state. So this is really important because students in California and New York and New Jersey, the top 1% is higher in those states than it is in other states. So again, depending on where you live, the cutoff for national merit scholar consideration is different. It's all state determined. But if you hit that threshold for the top 1% in your state, you then qualify for national merit, which means that A, that's something great you can put on your college application. B, that's also amazing because you can apply for scholarships for college and you can get money that's based on your merit, right? That's based on your performance. Second question that was asked, how does our course prepare students for the PSAT? So through the Windward Academy learning platform, we have hundreds of hours of lessons. We have 10,000 practice questions, all from past real exams. And the idea is that we want to help students take a practice test, analyze that exam so they know exactly where their mistakes are, prioritize review on high impact areas. So again, we want to make sure that if you're putting in that time, that you're really focusing on areas in which you're going to have a big return so that you can see that big growth that you're looking for. Reviewing explanations for every single practice test that you take is, again, super important, and having access to be able to learn all of the content that you need to be prepared for those exams. So kind of having all of that together, again, taking a practice test, but then connecting that practice test to this content that you need to review, that's what's critical. Just taking a test is not enough. You have to analyze it, you have to understand it, you have to review it, you have to learn from it. Then you have to put in the time to learn the content that you missed. Then you do another practice test. So a lot of current sophomore families are currently planning for the PSAT this fall, wanting to make sure that they put in time to study over the summer, prepare for that PSAT. But then, by the way, when you're studying for the PSAT, you're also studying for the ACT or the SAT, right? Because all the content is the same. It's just a matter of getting really solid in that content and then being ready for the specific structure of the exam. Let me see, another question came into the Q&A. Oh, is it better to take the SAT because of national merit? That's a great question. So the national merit considerations are for the PSAT, not for the SAT. So if you're required to take the PSAT, or most schools require it, sometimes families opt out of it and don't have their students take the PSAT. But the PSAT score only matters for college if you're in the top 1%. 99% of students who take it never tell colleges their PSAT score. It's not something that's reported on an application. So what a lot of students do is, even if they're taking the ACT, like if they take an ACT and SAT and they like the ACT better, if they're scoring really high on the ACT, then it's very likely that they would score really high on the PSAT as well. So what students do is, again, they take both, compare. 9 times out of 10, the scores are pretty comparable, or at least the patterns of mistakes are very similar, right? If I don't know subject-verb agreement on the SAT, I'm going to miss a subject-verb agreement question on the ACT, right? The content is virtually identical between the exams. So time that students put in to review for the SAT or ACT will also help them for the PSAT, right? Or the reverse is also true. Time that you put into reviewing for the PSAT will also help you for the SAT or the ACT. So because the content tested in those exams is virtually identical, in our platform, by the way, we tag lessons that are specific to SAT or specific to ACT. So we do want to make sure that we're sensitive to not having people put in time into things that they don't necessarily need. But 95% of what students study helps them for both exams. When students are choosing between SAT and ACT, it really usually comes down to more, are they comfortable doing math without a calculator? The timing, the pacing is a little bit different. So on the SAT, you get 10 more seconds on average per question. So it's a little bit less rushed of a pace. However, the trade-off is that you're doing math without a calculator, which naturally takes longer. And that the reading passages themselves, a lot of students find to have a little bit more advanced sentence structure and vocabulary. So even though you get a little bit more time per question, sometimes you need that extra time to just kind of understand the information being provided. Whereas the ACT, you're feeling the pressure, the time pressure a little bit more, but it's more straightforward. It's kind of like, hey, do you know the area of a trapezoid in this question? If you know it, you get it and you move on. If you don't know it, you guess and move on, right? It feels a little bit more straightforward. So in general, again, best thing for students to do, take a practice test of each one, not on the same day, not on back-to-back days, just again, to make sure that you're not overwhelming yourself. We don't want the second exam to be artificially lower because you're just exhausted, right? We want you to take both in a really fresh atmosphere. Compare the scores and see if one emerges as much stronger for you than the other. But again, when it comes to PSAT preparation, don't let that influence you for ACT or SAT, because ACT or SAT is a much bigger decision. The PSAT, again, it only matters if you're in the top 1%. Otherwise, it's just kind of a great practice experience, and To be honest, the PSAT is mostly for College Board to just collect data on all high school students as a way for them to just kind of track and monitor student growth. Okay, I want to be sensitive to time. But we do have another question. It is 5 Pacific time, so 8 o'clock for those of you joining on the East Coast. So feel free to hop off if you need to go. I will answer another question that just came in. The question is, to colleges, are ACT and SAT really the same? And the answer is yes. So 2016 is when we first saw more students taking the ACT compared to the SAT, and that trend kind of, or excuse me, 2012. 2012 is when we first saw more students taking the ACT than the SAT. And that kind of continued as the ACT got more and more popular, the SAT got less popular. That's when the SAT changed itself in 2016, where now the SAT test is much more like an ACT, right? So that was kind of College Board who makes the SAT. That was their way of trying to recoup some of that market share, was by changing their exam to kind of be more similar to an ACT. So truly, in the eyes of colleges, this was not true 20, 30 years ago, right? When SAT was kind of considered the more premier exam, used kind of more on the coast, whereas the ACT was used more in the middle of the country. That is completely not true anymore. Colleges really view the ACT and SAT the same. They're telling you what their average scores are for students on both exams. So really, truly, for a student to make this decision between ACT and SAT, the student should take the exam on which the student performs higher. Like, period, end of story, no reason to be concerned beyond that. Okay. I have so much more in my presentation, but we obviously won't keep you much longer. There's just so much to say about these topics that it's just, again, I can give these presentations for 2.5 hours sometimes, and parents are still there writing everything down and taking notes and asking questions. There's just a lot in this world for people to understand and digest and feel comfortable with. And so anyway, I'm really, really happy that you all joined us. What I will do is send a follow-up email to all of you who joined us today. We are offering free practice ACTs and practice SATs. These are real past exams. That is the most important thing for me to mention. These are not made up tests. These are real past tests that we have permission from ACT and College Board to be able to proctor to students. So we very frequently host virtual practice exams, and we're there proctoring live for students to give them that opportunity to take a past exam, to score it, to analyze it, to review their mistakes. So I will follow up an email to everybody who joined this evening, a link to be able to register for that, because it is free. Really important. You know, it's not like, hey, try a free trial and give a credit card and we start to charge you. I hate that. I would never do that to anyone else, because I hate when people do that to me. This is truly a free experience for students because we just want them to have this exposure, take a real exam, review it, learn from it. And then, of course, if they have questions about our program, we would love to help. But again, there's no pressure there. We really do want students to have this opportunity to take an exam and to learn from it. So I will follow up and send that link. I guess actually I can probably throw it in the chat right now. I'll put the link to be able to learn more about the practice test in the chat right now. So you're welcome to go and learn more and see if it works for you. We also always work with families. So if the times that we're offering our virtual proctoring don't work for your teen, we can always send self-proctoring instructions as well. But again, really important first step is just to take those diagnostics and then to be able to grow and learn from your mistakes. Any other questions? Everybody good? If you have any other questions, feel free to email me. I will be sending an email directly to all of you with the practice test information. So again, I'm more than happy to answer questions if you just want to respond to that message. And have a wonderful rest of your evening, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. Really appreciate it. Take care.